to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series within VMware. More specifically, we're looking at the VMware Certified Professional version 6, and in the last couple of episodes, we've been looking at virtual machines. Joining me back in the studios today is none other than Mr. Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. Ready to dive right into a new topic for us. We're going to be tackling a tool we haven't really addressed yet, which is the VMware vSphere Converter. The converter is a really cool utility because what it lets you do, well, what its original purpose was to take physical machines, so servers where you install the operating system on the bare metal, and convert them into virtual machines. They call that a P to V, physical to virtual. They usually write it P, the number 2 V, so P to V, conversions of machines. So back in the early days when ESX was rolling out and VMware was trying to get companies to adopt it, they couldn't say, yeah, deploy all this ESX infrastructure and then create new VMs from scratch. They wanted to help people migrate, to move from the old physical servers to the new virtual deployment. If a company opens today, they're going to be all virtual from the beginning, so they don't need the VMware converter. They just need to install VMs. But if you're migrating from traditional physical servers to virtual servers, the converter is really, really handy. So the way that it works is it reaches out to a physical machine, it grabs a copy of that physical machine, and then it deploys it as a virtual machine inside of your vCenter environment or inside of an ESX server. You don't actually have to have vCenter for this to work, although you certainly can. So when we do that, we can quickly and easily migrate over to a virtual environment without having to rebuild all of our machines. Technically, the converter does it for us. All right. Now, over the years, that's changed. Originally, it was designed to do physical servers to virtual, but now it also does V to V, virtual to virtual. And I know what you're thinking. If it's already a virtual machine, why would I need to convert it to a virtual machine? Well, here we're talking about virtual machines from other manufacturers. So you might have some existing virtualization environment, and now you're just moving to VMware. This tool is all about helping you do business with VMware, helping you get vSphere in your production environment and rolled out. And it does a really good job. All right. Now, I've been kind of high level on it. Let's go a little more detailed and talk about how this thing works. The way it works is you bring up a vSphere converter box, right? So you take a machine, and it only runs on Windows. So you've got to have Windows 7 or Windows 8 or Windows Server 2008, Windows Server 2012, one of those four. So you have a Windows machine, and you install the converter on it, right? So that becomes your converter server. I'm going to put server in air quotes there because if it's Windows Server 2008 or 2012, then yes, it's a server, right? But if it's Windows 7 or Windows 8, it's a workstation, but it's running the converter utility on it. There really is no difference between running on a server versus a workstation. So if you're trying to save some money, you can license Windows 7 or Windows 8 for less than you can license a server, then that works out great. But if you've got a server laying around, you can certainly reuse it. It's very flexible, right? Then you bring up the converter, and the converter scans the network. It helps you to find machines. Now, you can just manually type in the machine. You don't have to scan, but it basically identifies these machines. And when you tell it to convert, it reaches out to that machine and it installs an agent. Right? The agent is really important because how do you take an image of a machine while it's turned on? Well, usually you can't. Usually what you have to do is you have to shut the machine down and put in some kind of third-party imaging disk in it, right? So like Semantic Ghost or what are some of the big ones that are out there? Acronis True Image. Yep. Yeah, there's a handful of other ones that are out there that let you clone a disk while the machine is offline, right? And that's effectively what the converter wants to do. It wants to clone that disk, but it wants to do it while it's online. And so the VMware Converter Agent is a little program it installs, and what it allows it to do is capture an image of the machine while it's online. Well, if it's a supported system. Now, I mentioned the converter could only run on Windows. That's the converter itself. The agent, in other words, what we're going to install on the source machines, they support a ton of operating systems for it. Yeah, of course, they support Windows. So we've got Windows Server 2008, 2012. They also support Windows Server 2003, even though Microsoft doesn't support it anymore. I think just R2. Then they do Windows XP, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows Vista. I kind of left that one out. I'm going to leave Windows 10 off for now because it's not in the official list. So on the exam, Windows 10 is not in the official list, although in real life I've done it on Windows 10. But it's not officially supported yet. So really, most of the Windows platforms are all supported for power on conversions, right? Power on. So the machines are on, the agent installs, we do the conversion. It's not just a Windows world too, because we have Linux, right? You can do Red Hat Enterprise Linux. It's versions 6 and 7, I believe. Do I have a note on that?
3 and 6.
3 through 6. Shoot, not 7 at all. So glad I wrote that down. So Red Hat Enterprise Linux versions 3 through 6. We've got SUSE Enterprise Linux. It is versions 9 through 11. Ubuntu 10, 12, and 13. I don't actually know what happened to Ubuntu 11. Maybe it doesn't exist, but either way, VMware doesn't support it. So 10, 12, and 13, we got a lot of Linux boxes. And these are all for power on conversions. They can be on, and we do the conversion. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because we want to create as minimal a downtime as possible. If I have to take the machine offline to make an image, now users can't get to it. Now, maybe I schedule that for after hours or on the weekend. But if I'm in a 24/7 shop, when can I take that machine off? I can't, right? So if I can do it while it's online, the machine will be slower while I'm imaging it, but at least it's up. It's working. People can still do their work. And when it's done, now I've got a clone of the machine. We've cloned it, right? Now, what the converter does from there depends on us. It can shut off the original machine and start up the new machine. It can do that, right? And now you're running on the VM. And if something goes wrong, you can just shut the VM down and turn the original machine back on and you're back in business. Okay, what could go wrong? A question that doesn't even need asking, does it, Wes? We've seen a lot of things can go wrong. It doesn't just take an image of the machine. In addition to taking an image of the machine, it loads the drivers and the VMware tools, the things that we need for that virtual machine to be up and running in the vCenter and ESXi environment, right? Something can go wrong. The drivers can cause a problem, or more often it's the hardware driver still being there that causes a problem. I see it with RAID controllers a lot. So you have a RAID driver when you're on a physical machine, then you bring it into a VM and you don't see the RAID anymore because the RAID's all done by the underlying systems, and now you boot up like in Windows and you get a blue screen because of that driver. So now you've got to kind of work out the complexities there. You've got to make sure you update the driver prior to doing the migration. So those are things that could go wrong. And in that scenario, I might want to clone the VM to test it, but not actually shut the original one down. And you can do that, right? But if I don't shut the original down, then people are working in it, right? And if they keep making changes, I've now got this clone that's out of date. So what happens then? Well, for the supported operating systems, you can leave the agent on there and it can synchronize changes. So when you are ready to make the flip, you can say, hey, synchronize the changes with that machine and then shut it off. And that way it just gets what changes. It doesn't have to get the whole machine over again. And that's really useful if you have a huge amount of data. You just want to get what's changed. It synchronizes those in, but that's only with the supported systems, right? On the virtual side, let's talk about that. So on a physical box, we can connect any physical box, bring the settings in and turn it into a virtual machine, but we can't do that with all the virtual infrastructures. In fact, they only support a few. They support Hyper-V, so Microsoft's Hyper-V, and they support Red Hat Enterprise Linux with KVM or Xen. If you've got any of those three, you can do a power-on migration or conversion, get them brought into ESX. If you're running something else, right? Maybe you're running Citrix Xen Server or VirtualBox or something else, you can still do the conversion. It just isn't a power-on conversion. You're going to have to shut the VM down, right? And you can bring like a VHD from the old virtual PC or something like that. You can bring that into the converter and it'll convert it for you, right? But the machine has to be offline. So power-on conversions are kind of limited to the supported platforms. But the supported platforms are pretty much what you see out there in real life land. You don't usually see people deviate from those main ones. All right, so that's basically how it works. That's what it does. When you're done, when it's finished, it brings up the VM and it can shut the original machine down. It can uninstall the agent before it shuts it down. So the original machine is now back to its normal state, gives us kind of that failback, that safety net. And then you can run, and as long as everything's good, within a week of testing, you know that everything's good, you can get rid of the physical machine, and now it's converted. That's the whole point of the converter. All right. But it all begins with a pretty simple step, which is installing the converter. We need to get the converter installed on a machine. So I need a Windows box somewhere that's going to host the converter. And when I install it, there's two modes to install it. One mode is standalone, where this is the entire converter running right on a single machine, and that's what I normally use. But if you're going to be converting a lot of machines, then what you can do is you can split it up so that you have a converter server and then you have a management server. You can split it into two pieces. And that way, you might have more than one converting server and one management server that's controlling all of them. So if you're converting hundreds or thousands of machines, maybe you have a virtual desktop infrastructure, and so you've got 1,000 virtual workstations. and you want to convert them all over. Or 1,000 physical workstations. It would take a long time for one conversion box to do it. But if I had a bunch of conversion boxes, we could knock that out, right? So it's not really standalone anymore. Now you've got a client-server model. So it's going to ask us about that. The other thing we need is we need somewhere to store the images while they're being converted. And it's got to be a network share somewhere. So somewhere on your network, you're going to need an SMB network share created, or a CIFS share. So typically it's going to be a Windows box, but it could be a Linux box running Samba. You just need to have a CIFS share. And when you've got that, I just thought CIFS like nothing. It's CIFS, right? The Common Internet File Sharing?
Yeah, I think that's it. File system.
Yep, okay, oh, perfect. So we're going to set that up and share that out, and that's where we'll store the images while they're converted. It's not where we're going to run them from, right? When you bring them into ESX, they're going to run from a data store. But while it's working with them, it's got to store them somewhere, right? So that's where I need to be. I need to get the converter installed on my machine first, and then we'll create that file share. So let's kick things off. I've got this is my vCenter server. Where should I install my converter? I guess I can install it right here on vCenter. My vCenter server has a bunch of memory and extra resources, so it can handle holding the converter. The converter you get from VMware, if you purchase the vSphere suite, you'll have the download available from them. I downloaded it before the show, and so I've got the VMware converter right here for version 6. There is a converter for version 5.5 and 5.0. You need to run the latest version. So I've got this 6.0 version. And installing it is pretty straightforward. When you run through the installer, it's going to ask just a handful of questions, all related to typical install stuff. You can pretty much just hit next on this thing over and over again, and you'll get it installed. Okay. Now, I'm installing it on my vCenter box just because I only have so many resources here in the lab. In real life land, you'll probably want to use a dedicated box, because what's going to happen when you start imaging a machine? You're going to peg out that network adapter, right? It takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of CPU as it processes, and it eats up RAM like crazy, believe me. So you'll want a dedicated box for this. As I move forward, it's just asking me to sign off on the licensing agreement, which we'll gladly do because we have no other option. And then we'll install it onto our hard drive. And here's the decision where I figure out, is it going to be a dedicated machine where everything runs right here, or am I doing client server? If I'm doing client server, on the next page it's going to ask me, is this the server or is this the client? And you only need one client. I mean, you might do more than one, but technically you only need one client. But you can have more than one server, and now you get even more workload that you can do. I'll just do a local install, put both on the same machine. All right, then we'll go ahead and get it installed, and it's going to run and do its install. Now, while it's doing that, I'm going to jump over to another machine and create a network share on it. Okay, I need a network share so that I can store these images somewhere, right? So I'm just going to whip one up real quick on this machine. Doesn't necessarily matter where. I mean, you obviously want to make sure you have enough hard drive space and all that to be able to store the images. The images can be pretty big, right? If I'm imaging a physical machine and the physical machine has 10 terabytes of data, how big is my virtual image going to be? 10 terabytes. I'm going to need to store it somewhere, and I'll need to have that space. In fact, let me put that on my root drive. So definitely be aware of that as you create the shared folder. I'm going to break rules a little bit here too. I'm going to put it on my domain controller. In real life land, probably not where I would put it. You probably have a storage appliance somewhere that you can use, or something like that. But I'm going to go ahead and share it. And for the permissions, I'll just make sure that administrators can write to it. Whoops, administrators with a Z, it's very edgy. So I'll get that put in there, and I'll give the administrators full control. And I'm using the administrator account. You could create dedicated accounts for this. Here's my dedicated VMware converter account. But a lot of times, these are going to be administrators doing their task anyway, because you have to be an administrator to install the converter agent. So you might as well use that account. But you can certainly ratchet up the security on that if you want. All right, so I've got that created. I'm just going to test and make sure that I can actually get to it from my converter machine. My converter, it's finished installing, but I'm just going to test that out and make sure I can get to that share. So I'm going to connect to plabdc1/convert, and I can get to it, and I'm just going to quick test to make sure I can create a file in it. I need to make sure that I've got read-write permissions. So I'm just going to create a text document, and I do. Good. All right. So I can get to the share. I've got read-write permissions. So now I'm ready to fire up that converter. Okay, it's offering to run the converter for me. I mean, it created a desktop icon for me too, but we'll just let it run it for me, and it's going to launch. Now the converter itself, it's not, it's not amazingly spectacular or anything. It's just fairly cut and dry. What you're going to see is the option to convert a machine, the option to configure a machine, and then what's going on right now. And so we expect there to be nothing going on right now. Converting a machine is what we normally do. We're going to reach out and grab a copy of a machine, and we're going to create a VM. Configure a machine, what's that all about? Well, when we go to deploy this into ESX, we've got to create a virtual machine that mirrors the physical machine. And by default, it's going to do that. So if you have 8 gigs of RAM in the physical machine, it's going to create a virtual machine with 8 gigs of RAM. But we might want to adjust that. And you'll see in the wizard, it's actually easier in the wizard, but you can adjust the configuration of that machine, and that's what that button does. Is even during the conversion, you can choose the conversion and hit configure and make some adjustments to it even while it's running. It's kind of neat. And you can change the way that's going to be. Maybe you want to add some more memory or take some memory away when you bring it into a virtual machine. You might want to increase or decrease the hard drive sizes. You can do a lot of that stuff during the conversion. All right, so that's what we do with configure the machine. All right, now I have an application server sitting around, this guy right here, which is called PL-app01. So good old PL-app01. It's just a machine, it's sitting here, it's minding its own business, and I lied about its name. It's actually called PLAB DM01. Not that that makes that much of a difference. Well, I guess it sort of makes a difference. I need to know that name, because when I deploy my new machine, it's going to have the same name. And if I have both machines up at the same time, I'm going to get some conflicts, right? So I do need to at least be aware of that name, PLAB DM01. Also, if I browse the network, I'll kind of need to know it, or the IP, it's .7. All right, now this machine is running Windows Server 2012, which is good. That's a supported OS, so I'll definitely be able to migrate it, assuming I don't run into any other crazy problems, which is certainly possible, right? Problems normally arise from drivers. It's almost always a driver-related issue, but it could be permissions. You could have problems in Windows already, and let me tell you, I've heard this from people where they said, oh, you know, my physical machine was acting up, so I converted it to virtual. I figured, you know, it'd do better. And I always tell them, you know, if you had a problem that was a problem on the physical machine, you probably just converted the problem, and now you have the same problem in the virtual machine. If it was storage drivers or network drivers, yeah, that'll get fixed with the conversion. But if you've messed something up like permissions in Windows, it's going to port that stuff over, and you'll still have the same problem in your virtual machine. So it's not a magic cure-all, but it certainly does work in some cases. All right, so I want to convert this machine. Well, I don't actually do it here from this machine. I go back to where my converter is installed. And in the converter, I'm going to go up here to Convert Machine, and it's going to launch a little wizard, and I'll answer what I'm going to do. Now, I start with the source. Where's this coming from? And you'll see, powered on machine. I can bring it over from a VMware infrastructure virtual machine, so maybe it's running on another VM somewhere else. I can bring it in from VMware Workstation or other virtual machine. That would be VMware Fusion, VMware Player, right? We can get from all of those. I don't think I mentioned Player earlier, but it does support that. We can bring it from a backup image or third-party virtual machine. This is the offline one, the power off, right? Not a power on conversion. So if I have a image from Semantic Ghost or Norton Ghost, whatever they call it, a Cronus True image, even a Windows backup or a Semantic backup exec backup, I can create the VM right from a backup of the physical machine. That's pretty cool stuff, right? And then you've got Hyper-V server coming from Hyper-V. Also, I should mention your third-party virtual machine. This would be things like the older Microsoft virtual machines, VirtualBox, products like that you can actually convert in using this option too. Right? When you do these, it's basically just bringing in the hard drives. It won't know how many CPUs you need, how much memory you had, right? That stuff's not in a backup. That's not in a virtual hard drive. So if you choose this backup image, you're definitely going to have to use that configure machine button, because you're going to have to tell it how much memory and disk and so on to have, because otherwise it won't know. With the other ones, it can actually lift the configuration from the running machine because it uses the agent to detect that. So you get a lot more power with the other options. This is kind of a last-ditch effort, right? We use this one if we have to. All right. In my case, I've got a powered-on machine that I'm going to point to, and I can point to it by name if I remember it, right? That was PLAB DM01, or I could put in the IP address if I don't remember the name, right? So I could just say 192.168.0.7. And actually, I'm going to use the IP anyway, because I don't know if I set up DNS on these things in the first place. So let me just go with IP, because that'll always work. And then I can punch in an administrator. Now, this account doesn't have to be like a domain admin, but it has to be an administrator on that machine, because we've got to be able to install the agent to it. Right? We've got to have that work, and we've got to provide our password, which I think I remember. Then it's going to ask what OS it is. Now, why does it care about the OS? Can it detect that? Well, it can once the agent's on it. But the agent's not on it yet. That's what we're trying to install. So it's just asking, is it Windows or Linux? All right, so we've got to tell it. And then once that's done, you can hit View Source Details, which is a great way to verify this is working. Because let me tell you, for me, 9 times out of 10, it doesn't work. And the reason, it's almost always the same reason, the Windows firewall, right? Or in Linux, it might be IP tables or whatever you're running, that usually this type of connection is blocked on a server. On a workstation, you might get through, but on a server, it's blocked. So I fully expect this to fail. Let's see. Maybe I'll be wrong for once. But for once, I'm actually wrong all the time. But if I hit View Source Details, it's reaching out to that machine, and in theory, it should connect. See how it says connecting to source machine up here? It's trying to connect. And if it does, I'll get a little output here that lets me know that it connected. But you know, it is sitting here taking a while, so I'll bet the Windows firewall is blocking it. Yeah, see, unable to contact the specified host. The default Windows firewall doesn't let it in. So I've got 2 choices. Choice 1, I could open up a hole in the firewall for me to connect, or choice 2, I could turn off the firewall. Turning off the firewall is faster, but if this is a production system, what did you just do to your security? That's not so good, right? So poking a hole in the firewall is a little bit better. For IP tables or for Windows firewall, what I normally do is create a rule in the firewall that allows every connection from the IP address of the converter, right? So if it's the IP address of the converter, allow any connection, right? That way you don't have to muck about with ports and all that stuff. It's just, that's the converter, it's allowed to connect. But for the sake of this show, because I don't want it to be too terribly long, I'm just going to turn the firewall off, which again is not necessarily a great production decision. So I'm going to go into the Windows firewall. And so it's turned on. In here, you can allow an app through the firewall, but you really need to go to the advanced screen to create a rule that lets the IPs in. So I'm just going to do this right from here and turn the Windows firewall on or off, and we'll just turn it off. Okay. Once that's done, there we go. Now I should be able to jump back over to my converter, and we can try this again. I'm going to hit View Source Details again, and it's going to reach out. And I got unable to SSH to the source machine, make sure the SSH daemon is running. Did I tell it Linux? Oh, I did. So I say Windows doesn't run SSH. That's an odd error to get, but that will probably make a difference there. That's what I wanted to see. Okay, it was able to connect. Okay, so now it asks me, hey, we're going to install this agent, and the agent is going to let us do the conversion. When we're done, what do you want me to do? Should we leave the agent on there, or should we remove it? Now, the default is automatically uninstall when the import succeeds. If I choose that, it's going to import the machine, uninstall the agent, shut down the machine. So at any time, I can go and turn that machine back on, and it's all back to the way that it was. And that's normally what we want. But if I'm just doing a test migration, I want that other machine to stay up, and later on I'm going to synchronize the changes. I probably want to leave the agent on there, and that's what the second option says. I mean, it doesn't say leave the agent on there. It just says I'll manually uninstall the files later. So leave the agent on there so we can still synchronize changes, and we'll get the final conversion done later. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and say yes on this one. And now it's deploying the agent. It's reaching out to that machine and installing it. If it's Linux, it just opened up an SSH session and it's deploying it. On Windows, it's using Windows RM, and it's connecting up, pushing the files over a temporary share that was created, and getting them installed. So that does take a moment. If you're watching on the other machine, you're not going to see anything. Users could be in this machine. This could be a virtual desktop, and the users could be in here and working, and they're not going to see any difference. If they're watching in their task manager, which, you know, granted most users aren't doing, but if they're watching in their task manager, they might actually see the process kick in that is showing that install happening in the background. But you know, mine's idle. It might actually already be done, but it's going to be getting installed in the background, and that's all they would notice. And then once it's done, we're ready to do the conversion. The machine will get slower during the conversion. Think about what you're doing. You're grabbing a copy of the entire hard drive and sending it over the network. The bigger the machine is, the longer that's going to take, and the more bandwidth it's going to eat. So be aware that while they might not notice the conversion is happening, they'll notice the machine getting slower. Oh, operation could not be completed due to incorrect user credentials. That would explain why I didn't see the little pop-up. So let me go back here. Apparently, I either spelled administrator wrong or put in the wrong password, or a combination of both. Looks like the wrong password. So let's try that again. And try it one more time. So now it's deploying that agent, or so it says. I'll go and watch on the application server, and I saw my VM tools pop up for just a second there. There's some system activity, but I should see that installer running in the background. It happens pretty quickly, and I'm not going to make the same mistake. I'm going to watch for here, see if I get an error. It says connecting the machine. The deploying disappeared. There we go. So now it shows that it fully deployed, and it harvested the data about the machine. That's the nice part about the agent. It looked at it and it said, hey, it's Windows Server 2012, 64-bit. It's got a 40 gigabyte hard drive with 2 CPUs. It's got 4 gigs of RAM and 1 network adapter. So when we build a virtual machine, that's what we need, right? It knows what to have. We wouldn't get that from a backup, but because it's a powered on machine, it can harvest it. And so it's showing me the drive, how it's partitioned, because we may have more than one partition on the drive. It's going to get that and learn the information. It's also showing me the estimate of size that I'm going to be consuming here, right? 10 gigs in this case is what I'm using on that hard drive. All right, so that's good. Everything looks good there, and that means we're ready to proceed. So I'm going to hit next, and now it's going to ask, where am I going to put this thing? I'm going to take an image of that machine. It's got to go somewhere. So up here, I can have it go straight to a VMware infrastructure virtual machine. So go right into ESX, or VMware Workstation or other VMware virtual machine. I might be taking it from ESX and moving it into a workstation. That's great for test and lab environments. You got a developer who wants to try something out, you can throw it right through here. But in my case, I'll just go to a live virtual machine. If you're going to go to a live virtual machine, you got to specify which one it's going to be, or which host it's going to reside on. So you can punch it in here. Now, when I deploy it, I could put in an ESX host here, or, this is where it's fun, I could put a vCenter server in. If I put a vCenter server in, now I'll have the choice of all the different hosts inside of vCenter. So that's what we normally want to do, is point it to vCenter. Now, I'm actually on the vCenter server, but it doesn't know that. So I'll just go ahead and tell it the server and see if I can get the right password on this one. All right, now normally I'd hit next here and start to deploy to the vCenter server, but I know I don't have enough time to do that because it's going to take that image of that machine, and it's going to convert it, and it's going to deploy it onto vCenter, and that takes a while. So what I'm going to do is something a little different. I'm going to send it to storage. All right, I'm going to send it to that share that I made earlier instead of going straight to vCenter. This is going to give me time to edit the machine if I want to, or deploy it other places. And the way we can do that is in the destination type, instead of VMware Infrastructure Virtual Machine, I'm going to pick VMware Workstation or other VMware Virtual Machine. Now, I'm not going to send it to a workstation. It's going to drop it off in the shared folder, and it's going to leave it there. And that way I can mess with it and copy it wherever I want after this and make use of it. So then it's going to ask me for the product, and you'll see like VMware Workstation 11, 10, and so on. What it's really asking me here is the hardware revision that it's going to create for that virtual machine. I'm going to stick with VMware Workstation 11, and I'll be fine there. You have to be careful, because if you start choosing things like VMware Fusion, it can pick a hardware version that's not compatible with ESX. Then we can specify the virtual machine, which it already knows, and where it's going to put the thing. And I'm going to specify that share that I made earlier, which was on my DC. So I'm just going to punch that right in there. That's where I'm going to send it to, and I'll need to give it a username and password for that. Now, that is a domain server, so I've got to put in the full name here. So we'll do that, and whatever my password happens to be. And that should be enough to get that going. My OK button is off the bottom of the screen, so I've got to kind of get creative with moving this around, or maybe I can just press enter. There we go. All right. Now this screen is really important. What it's doing is it's showing me what it's about to do. It's not doing it yet. This will let me change the configuration of the machine. This is what that configuration machine button does on the main screen. So I see all the various settings that it auto-detected. If this were coming from a backup, most of this would just be defaults, and it would probably be too low for what I want, and I would need to edit and change that. So as I look at it, I've got 2 CPUs and 4 gigs of memory. Maybe I want to change that. So I could go and edit that setting, and now right in here I can change the amount of memory that it's got. I can increase or decrease it. I can change the CPUs, change the network, and so on. This is just like editing the hardware of a VM, because that's exactly what you're doing. So we can tweak all of that stuff, the things that we want to modify or whatever. But the thing I really wanted to point out is that when you go to advanced, here's where we have synchronized changes. Okay, what does synchronized change mean? Well, that means, hey, we've already made the image, now we just need to get what's changed, right? This is how we'd run that delta, and you've got perform final synchronization. See how that's checked for me? That's because this is the final one, right? I am taking an image and it's going to be done. I'm not going to be running anymore. If I choose synchronize changes, I can tell it to run immediately after cloning. It's going to clone the machine and then get anything that's changed off of that original machine and get it put in place. All right. And you've got post-conversion, stuff to do afterwards. Power off source machine. Okay. I'm just taking an image and dropping it into a share. So I can leave the source machine on. But if I'm about to power on a new machine, I'm going to have duplicate names and duplicate IPs. Things are not going to go well, right? So I probably want to power off the source so I can power on the new machine. And I can install the VMware tools onto the destination machine. I probably want that. You can customize guest preferences, let you set up like an unintended answer file, and you can remove restored checkpoints, those things, because they don't typically work anymore. Your restore points in Windows would be from back when it was a physical machine, which includes the physical drivers, and that would cause a problem. You probably want to remove those. And reconfigure the destination virtual machine means bring that virtual machine up and have it with the right drivers and functioning inside of ESX. Otherwise, it's going to come across exactly as it was on a physical machine, and that may not be what we want. So those are all some important settings to tinker with. You've got other things like services. You can actually tailor which Windows services start and stop and all that. I mean, you can get really detailed. This is a Windows machine. You get the same stuff for Linux. It's got that visibility as long as it's one of the supported Linux platforms. All right. Assuming you got everything the way you want, though, you hit next. It gives you the summary again, and you finish up. And now the conversion is going to start. And you can watch the conversion right here. Now, the more data in that machine, the longer this is going to take. Mine's 10 gigs, so it probably won't take that long. But in real life, your servers are going to be much larger. And so this could take 20 minutes. It could take an hour. I've seen Exchange servers with massive databases that took like 8 hours. And if you do it online, performance on the server is degraded while that's happening. So somebody could be in PLAB DM01. Somebody could be in this machine working right now. But if I look at it, see the VMware converter process, and it's running at about 20% CPU, and it's eating 28 megs of memory. It's eating up resources on this system, especially on the network side, right? And just think, show me network. Yeah, Ethernet. So I'm running at 540 megabit right now. That's half my network adapter, right? I have a gigabit adapter in this, and half of it's being eaten up for the conversion. So you're going to see network degradation, CPU, memory, they're all being hit, especially disk I/O, that's all being read too, all while it's running. But the system is online. You know, people can get in there and work. And these are artificial throttles that are being put in place. You could actually tell it to go bigger if you wanted to get it done faster at the sacrifice of performance. So you've got those options. When you choose a job here, down at the bottom, so I'm back in my converter. When you choose a job down here, you can see the task status and see how it's going, right? I see that it's running. I'm already 42% complete, but it also gives me an estimate for the time remaining. How much longer is it going to take? And if there are any errors, they would turn up down here, right? Basically, at this point, it's running. There's not much else to do other than wait. But while we're waiting, let me go and look at the share that I made. And what we'll see is that it's created a folder in here for the virtual machine, because I might be cloning more than one VM. And inside of it, you're going to see a VMX. That's the configuration file for the new VM that says how much memory and hard drive and all that. And a VMDK. That's the virtual machine disk, right? Those are the two main files we need to get a virtual machine into ESX. There's a lock file that just shows that it's in use right now. When that lock file goes away, that's how I'll know when it's done with the conversion, right? But otherwise, it's converting it, and it's just going to run, and that file is going to grow to mimic the amount of data that I have on the server. There's a very light amount of compression applied to it, but it's not terribly effective because they're going for speed here, not efficiency. All right, so that one's going to churn along. I could configure the machine like I mentioned earlier, even while it's on. So I can hit configure, and you'll see options in here to tweak and set that up. I don't have a need to do it because we used our edit screen in the wizard, got everything set the way we want, and we just let it run. When it's done, now I can just import it into any other machine. Import it into a vCenter deployment or whatever. If I had chosen a vCenter deployment, the next step here would be for it to process that virtual machine and then deploy it, which would take, well, it would take twice as long.
It seems like a lot of work if you don't know exactly what you're doing now. And Don, it does look like we're coming to the end of another episode, but this one looks like it could help on certification exam as well as in a production environment. Got any final words of wisdom when it comes to moving physical to virtual machines?
Oh yeah. This isn't just a garbage utility we talk about because it's on the exam. This is one that I've used in production many, many times. It's very effective. It does a great job, and it does help you migrate to a virtual environment really quick. the key piece of advice I can give you, and this is not exam advice, but real life advice, don't get rid of your source machine until you're absolutely positive the virtual machine is working the way that you expect it to. Because there's a lot that changes. A lot of drivers, a lot of underlying infrastructure. You may have performance issues. The server might look great, but then Monday rolls around and all your users come in and like, oh, that server's so slow, right? And now you've got to try and find out why. And maybe you just add more memory or something like that. But if you can't figure out why, you need to be able to roll back to that source machine. So keep the source machine around for a little while, at least a week, preferably longer, just to make sure that you don't actually need it. You go and shut it off. That way you're not eating up power. But don't sell that server on eBay right away. Just wait a little bit. Make sure the virtual machines are performing adequately. If something goes wrong, don't hesitate to go back to the source. It's sitting right there. You can always do the conversion again. And with the conversion, what I did here, where I dumped it to a share, that's pretty non-invasive. I can now take that virtual machine and bring it up in VMware Workstation or VMware Fusion on my own laptop and test it out. So you can do the testing in a way that doesn't impact the rest of the network. So those are all things to keep in mind. Also be aware that not every virtual machine is not every physical machine is suitable for becoming virtual. Sometimes there's hardware that we depend on that doesn't work in a virtual machine. So for example, we used to have a fax server. So it had this 16-port modem, I think it was 24-port actually, modem board that was in it. There's no way to virtualize that hardware modem board. So it just had to stay physical. It's not a crime to have physical servers. You just need to identify when that's necessary. So be aware that sometimes a machine just can't be converted.
Well, Don, thank you as always for joining us here in the studios at IT Pro TV, and thank you, the viewer, for watching. Signing out at IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.